Welcome to the Story Fulfilled podcast, where we deep dive into how each character and story in the Bible come together to fulfill the story of God.
I'm Abby.
I'm Jay.
And I'm Fletcher. And today's episode of the Story Fulfilled podcast, we are talking about Tamar and Judah.
So just a quick disclaimer for anybody listening to this with young kids. There are some mature subject matters in this episode and in this story that may not be suitable for younger audiences. So parents, you may want to preview this episode before sharing with children under the age of 12.
But as always, we encourage you to read the story for yourselves. And if you want more context to see what happens next, there's no spoilers. It's all happened already. Happened, 4,000 years ago. So today's story is found in Genesis 38.
Okay, so for the question for today, as Abby mentioned that there's some maybe mature subject matter in here, I was thinking about how when a TV show gets moved over to Netflix only, sometimes they bump up the mature content and sometimes they ruin it, if I'm honest. But that led to the question of if you could have any book of the Bible turn into a TV show.
A mature no, not a mature.
Which would you pick? So any book of the Bible that you would like to see turned into a TV show.
Okay, so I totally thought I already had my answer, but now I'm second guessing myself. So I was going to say Judges, just because although it's awful, there's actually some really crazy content in there that you're just like looking at and you're like, oh, whoa, that happened. There's a lot of battles, which makes good TV content.
And so the final episode really mixes it up.
I know, it does not end well, right?
No, it does not.
Mature content.
Yeah, mature content for the last episode.
So I was going to say that, but then I was kind of thinking Genesis because like that'd be cool to see how creation comes together. And then I was also thinking like 1 Samuel.
Abby, are you just going to choose the whole Bible?
She's doing the whole Bible. She's stolen like 3 of my answers already.
Yeah, because I like David. So I think I'm going to land with 1st or 2nd Samuel. I'm going to do both 1st and 2nd Samuel. It's going to be a double season because they're kind of together anyways. Okay. So I can do that.
All right. I was just thinking, Abby's stealing all the kind of main stories and the really cool things that happen. I'm going to go with Ezekiel's prophecy and stuff and how that gets fulfilled throughout the history. So there's a ton of cool prophecy that actually happens historically, and you get to see that. So let's go with Ezekiel. And there's a ton of stuff that gets fulfilled, and you can do that in the TV. I think it would be cool. Alexander the Great's in there somewhere, too.
Yeah, okay.
There you go.
So as I was thinking about which book I would like to see made into a movie, and we were kind of just talking about it before we hit record, and Abby kind of threw a joke out there and said like, well, what about something like Amos or whatever? And I was like, oh yeah, actually Amos. I would actually love a TV show about Amos, because you got this just humble farmer who's going about his life, and God's like, hey, I want you to go give a message to the king. And he there's so much opposition to the message, and he even says like, listen, I'm not even a prophet, I'm just a farmer, and I'm just doing what God has told me to do. And so I just love the idea of this normal everyday guy going about his job and being brought into the mission of the Lord.
Yeah, good answers. And for the record, the reason we did not pick the Gospels are because The Chosen is already a great TV show. You should go watch it. Little plug there. And it's already a TV show. Same with the Book of Acts. So that's why we didn't pick those.
There you go. So if you have a suggestion for a TV show that you would like to see as a result of a book of the Bible, email it to us at story@bfmc.org. Or if you have any other questions that you would like us to ask at other episodes, feel free to send those along.
All right, so if you've been exposed to the Bible for a while, you've probably heard the stories from the last few episodes. But this one isn't told as much because it's a harder story to hear and it has some more mature parts. But like all of the Bible, it is useful. So we're going to talk about it the best we can and see what we can learn from it. So we'll start with some historical background. It's been pretty easy giving historical context for the last few stories. We've been, who did we have first? Enoch. And then, a few generations later, Abraham. Generation later, Isaac and Jacob, Joseph. And today we're going to continue on with a nice easy generation. Jacob's son is named Judah. And he has a lot of sons, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But for now, It's around 16 to 1500 BC. Again, that's the traditional date for Judah. The dates aren't exact. There is so much debate on when it actually happened that we can't give exact years because of how much argument there is. But yeah, it's around 1600 BC as when Judah lived. So yeah, geography.
Yeah, so Abraham's family lives in Canaan, as we know, and a lot of other people. And God actually told Abraham that the Canaanites would be destroyed for their wickedness and to not mix with these families. He wanted to keep his people separate. Now, we do have to make a note that this wasn't a race thing. Abraham's family came from a similar area, and most people did look the same, but God wanted this separation of culture for his people. And we'll see that when the Mosaic Law is written. And there are several laws that are put in place to differentiate themselves from the Canaanites. God saw them as wicked people because of their practices. So if you want to read Deuteronomy 18, it outlines that a little bit more. Now, this story takes place in Canaan, which today is actually now spread out over several different countries. And this includes Lebanon, Israel, northwestern Jordan, western Syria, and Palestine. There are a lot of complicated political issues around Palestine being its own nation that you can look into yourself. But if you don't know where it is, it's kind of located in Israel and along the Gaza Strip.
Great. So we're going to jump into the story. And in order to jump into today's story, we have to rewind a little bit and go back to Jacob. And we know that Jacob's marriage was complicated, to say the least. He was kind of tricked into a situation where he now had two wives, but he loved one more than the other. The difficulty was the wife that he loved was barren at the time, and so he ended up having relationships with both wives, and through Leah he had four sons named Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. And because Rachel couldn't have children, she told Jacob to sleep with her servant Bilhah, and she had two sons named Dan and Naphtali. And then Leah realized that she was done having kids, and so she gave Jacob her servant and named Zilpah, and she gave birth to two sons named Gad and Asher. And then Leah finally, has two more sons named Issachar and Zebulun, and then also has a daughter named Dinah. And then God gave Rachel a child, and he was Joseph, and then later on was Benjamin, which the translation for Benjamin actually means youngest. So when they named Benjamin, that was kind of like the signal of
it's over.
Youngest.
We're done. No more.
So yeah, 13 children in total. That
That's
is a crazy number. 4 different moms.
Wow.
I wanted to add that, yes, Joseph had multiple wives, and God has talked about polygamy being a bad thing, and they don't want it. And then we see Jacob having a bunch of wives, and that's out of deception. It's not because it was the right thing to do. Jacob had multiple wives, and he was wrong for it. We're not going to praise Joseph for having multiple wives.
There's often an objection to the Bible because people say that there's polygamy in there, and they talk about how that goes against what we stand for as Christians. And as you search through the scriptures, there's no instance where God has ordained the polygamy and said, "This is what I want. This is my plan for you to have multiple wives." It's not given as an order or a command by God. God still blesses people who are in those relationships and still leads them, but it's not a decree of the Lord.
Right. So 13 children, and today we're focusing on number, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah. Number four. Judah. So he isn't talked about that much, but he's still a very important character.
Well, kind of.
No, sorry. The story isn't talked about.
Yeah.
Judah is talked about
right.
a lot. He's the genealogy of Jesus.
On.
So
Yeah, kind
his
of a
line
big deal
continues but the story we're talking about doesn't. So Judah decides to move away from his family into the land of Canaan, away from the Israelites that now exist. He befriends an Adulamite. I'm not sure where Adulamite. It's in Canaan, and it's a city. He befriends a man named Hira and marries the daughter of a Canaanite man named Shua. We don't know his wife's name. And remember, in the last few episodes, God has told his whole family not to join with the Canaanites. Don't marry them. Don't become like them. Don't do their practices. He wanted his people separate. Again, not for racial reasons, but for cultural reasons. They, again, like Abby said, Deuteronomy 18 kind of shows what they were into. It wasn't good stuff. So you'll see what they like if you look into that. So while Judah was living there, he had 3 sons named Onan, and Shelah. When was old enough for his father found him a wife, and she was called Tamar. And we only get like 2 verses about and it says, was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord took his life. We don't know what he did. We don't know why he was killed, but he was evil, and he was killed.
That's funny. That's like the opposite of Enoch.
Yeah. I was just going to say, like, what a contrast to Enoch, who we have a very short, and he walked with the Lord, and then he was no more.
Was evil, and he's dead.
Instead of walking with the Lord and was no more, he was evil in the sight of the Lord.
So if you're ever if you're like not really sure what to pray, it's like, Lord, make me like Enoch and not like
Not like So now in that time in the culture, and after again with the Mosaic law that comes into place, there was a practice called Levirate marriage. When a man died without producing an heir, his brother would sleep with the widow to give her a child in his brother's name, so that his lineage could continue. This also served as a way to take care of widows in their society. It kept them in the family and protected them so they weren't outcast. And he was even put into God's law when Moses wrote it in years later, or God wrote it, I guess. But yeah, Levirate marriage was a common practice back then, just in the culture and then also in the law. So Judah's next son was Onan, and he was to produce a child with Tamar in order to give his brother a son. Onan realized that if he did this, he would get less inheritance because his brother would now have a son that would get inheritance. So he slept with her, and then before getting her pregnant, he stopped. And he refused to give his brother an heir. And this was displeasing to God, and the Lord took his life as well. So yeah, that was a mistake. And we just wanted to clarify what he did wrong.
Right.
So, what he did wrong. We see that he refused to give his brother an heir. And the problem with that is Levirate marriage was ordained by God, and he was commanded to give a son to his brother, and he didn't do that. He stopped, right? And a lot of people come up and say, he had sex with her, that's why it was a sin, or he spilled a seed on the ground, that's why it was a sin. Right. And that's not the whole story. Of course, he wasn't supposed to just continue to have sex with her and not get her pregnant. Right. But the big problem was he didn't obey the law. Right.
One of the interpretations of this text is tied to sexual sin, and that's not the takeaway. The takeaway is that he placed his dependence in himself and his ability to provide for himself by thwarting the plan to, like you say, for the inheritance to be passed on to someone else.
Yeah, he chose greed, right?
Yeah.
He chose to please himself, and then he chose to make what was best for his biological kids, fully biological by his choice. And so, just chose by greed.
Another question I kind of had is, why did God kill and Onan, even though they were surrounded by a sinful culture? They were living with the Canaanites. Their whole kind of area was sinful and doing terrible things. Yet those two were chosen to die, and those were the chosen children, right? They're sons of Judah. Why just the two of them, kind of thing?
Right, and I mean, it's an important question for us to wrestle with. I think my leaning would be that they're sinful, surrounded by sinful cultures for sure, called to be separate, called to be holy, called to be a blessing to the nations, and to be set apart. And they, in their behavior, were behaving just like the nations around them. And so in some ways, it seems as though God is saying to the whole family, I have a way that I want you to operate, and be careful.
It almost feels like what much has been given, much has been expected. It's
right.
kind of like the blessing has been passed from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob to Judah, and now his sons, right. And they're just tossing it to the wind.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably one of the reasons why kind of they were killed off, is because they had a lot to live up to, and they were not doing that. So now Judah's lost 2 sons that were both married to Tamar. And in Judah's head, he kind of blames her and says, Tamar's the reason that my kids are dying. There's no way he's marrying my youngest son, Shelah. So what he does is says that he'll give Tamar to Shelah because he's still young. But in reality, he had no intention of ever giving him to Tamar. And kind of in the rules of Levirate marriage and stuff, you were allowed to refuse it. Or as a father, you were allowed to say, no, go off and be a widow, and they could go back to their family. So Tamar had the option to just go back to her family. But Judah promised and said, no, you can have my next son, while lying about it, kind of thing. So that's probably not the best thing that Judah could have done.
Right.
So let's continue on. Years later, Judah's wife dies, and after he mourns, he goes out with his friends, Hira, to a place called Timnah, which is again in Canaan, to shear his sheep. Tamar hears of this and has figured out that Judah has no intention of giving her Shelah. She kind of figured it out. And since he's already grown up, she decides to take matters into her own hands. She dresses up with a veil and sat on the road to Timnah. And Judah sees her, but doesn't recognize her, and he thinks she is a prostitute. He solicits her, and she asks what he will pay. He offers a goat, and Judah doesn't have a goat with him. He's gone to shear his sheep. But he gives his seal or his ring and his cord and his staff. This is basically his ID and a promise that he's going to come back and pay her for the services.
It's like a credit card deposit.
Yeah, credit card deposit for the goat that he's going to give. So it's also his sign of power. So he's willing to give them to her just to sleep with her.
Can we just pause there?
Yeah, absolutely.
Why isn't Judah dead? Like,
Yeah, well, that's the thing, right? Like, we're not going to go into it, but
probably smart.
But Judah, come on.
I know.
What are you doing, man?
Kind of scummy.
It is a very scummy thing to do. I think that maybe, and I would never say that the Bible is incomplete but it seems to be missing some commentary here on Judah. But I do think that as we continue through the story, we see the end of the story, which is what's really important, and he realizes some things about himself. But man,
another thing with the prostitutes in that time, it's kind of it's both, obviously it's a sexual thing because he has sex with her, but a common thing was fertility, sex, and prostitution in that matter was really a way to honor pagan gods,
right?
For fertility. So if he goes and says, "Oh, I'm going to have good crops,"
right?
That's another aspect to it.
That's true. It was a form of idol worship that took place.
So he sleeps with her and then leaves without his signet ring and his staff and his cord. Judah later returns with the goat, so he's going to pay, but he can't find her.
Good, honest man.
Good, yeah. But Tamar returned home, and Judah couldn't find her. So he asked the men that were around there, and he told them that there was no prostitute there. So he's like, oh, okay, I guess I don't have to pay anybody if there's nobody to find. So he goes back home. And 3 months later, Judah gets word that Tamar is pregnant. He knows that she isn't married because he wouldn't give his son. And because she is technically betrothed to Shelah, it's considered adultery, not just fornication in that time. And Judah goes, let's bring her out and have her burned.
Right.
So I wanted to ask, why burn? Why such a steep
because
punishment?
I thought it was stoning.
Yeah,
like
that's
so
the normal punishment, right?
I dug into it a little bit,
Great.
and it's because she was the daughter of the high priest.
Judah being
Shem. So
really?
she was actually Shem's daughter.
Okay.
Who's from Noah.
Noah's son, yeah.
And so being the daughter of the high priest, it was actually a burning that was supposed to.
Because it's even worse if you're the pastor's kid, I guess.
That's right.
Oh no. Yeah, no.
Great.
Good luck,
Yeah.
buddy. No. So yeah, that's okay. That's interesting.
Yeah.
So it's even stricter punishment. Normally, I guess it would just be stoning for
Just be.
just
Be
be stoning.
stoning.
You're still dead, but I think burning is a heck of a... Tamar comes out, and everybody's expecting her to be burned, and she comes out and he says, the father of the child is the owner of these, and she holds up the signet
What a
ring and the
power
staff
move.
and the cord and goes, this is the father. Everybody now realizes, and Judah realizes it immediately, and he goes, I'm wrong.
Yeah.
He immediately admits that he was wrong, and he's like, oh, she's more righteous than me. I'm wrong. Which is such a, it's the best way to react, I guess.
Yeah.
He didn't try to hide it. He didn't try to deny it. He was wrong. He admitted it.
Indeed, it was the right response in that moment.
Yeah.
What I find interesting, and I think that we can apply this to our own lives as well, when we're faced with sin in our lives, opportunity for sin, and there's a struggle and a wrestling and shouldn't I, and whatever that internal struggle is that happens. But oftentimes after we've committed whatever the sin is, we are given a reassurance. Oh, it's gone away. I don't have to deal with that anymore. And that's what he goes back to pay the price, and she's gone. And his initial thought is, yeah, I'm off the hook. Okay, that's good. I mean, my stuff is missing, but it's just stuff. It's okay.
Yeah.
But
and
that's
it's just some girl that I'm probably never going to see again, which
right?
is the
yeah.
easy part.
Yeah. But it's that stuff that we need to be reminded of and aware of sin in our life. Sin has lingering effects that catch up to us, and this is what happens with Judah. The ring and the cord and the staff reappear, and when we kind of just flippantly sin, we forget that the effects of sin linger and they show up. Mm-hmm. They come back. Mm-hmm. And so our best response is actually to come clean before. So Judah, I mean, we're glad that he came clean when he did, but it's best to cut it off before it. If
he admitted it before, he wouldn't have had to go through the embarrassment of being called out for.
Absolutely.
For So in the end, Tamar ends up giving birth to twins, twin boys. One of them, Perez, who is in the line of David and later in Jesus. Mm-hmm. And just I might add, Perez is the youngest. He wasn't the oldest.
Yeah.
Which is a very common
Perez
thing.
Right.
Not Perez Hilton, no.
Not Perez Hilton.
Perez, son of Judah.
And Tamar. We made a Perez Hilton reference. This is
so yeah, just some questions and closing stuff. I like that Tamar didn't try to get Judah in trouble, although she definitely could have. She just wanted what she was promised and kind of what she was owed. She just holds him up. This is who the father is.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that they don't talk about anybody's reaction to her saying it. So they were probably just in shock, and then Judah just to me is like, oh yeah, it's me. Right. It's like, okay, let's shut down this thing before anything happens. Yeah. But it is interesting that nobody reacts.
Yeah, when I'm reading that, I'm hearing this collective gasp, like,
yeah.
And then Judah's like, oh, I guess it was me. I have to admit it. I'm caught. Yeah. Next up, if you go back a chapter, Genesis 37, it's a story of how it's a much more common story that you hear in the Bible, but it's when Joseph gets. He was almost killed, but then sold by his brothers, and he gets sent away to Egypt. And Judah was kind of the instigator. He said, maybe we shouldn't kill him, but let's at least sell him and get him out of our way. Right. And Judah's the one who kind of instigates that. And now he's been caught up in this whole scheme, and he repents. And then we go to chapter 39, or not 39, sorry, the end of the story of Joseph. And his brothers come begging for food. Mm-hmm. And he says, you know what? I have to keep one of your brothers. I'm going to keep Benjamin. Mm-hmm. And then Judah comes up and says, no, I'll take me instead, take my life instead of my brothers. So he goes from this willing to sell his brothers into slavery to I'll sacrifice myself. And he learns his lesson in the end, which is really cool.
And it's so neat that it's we see it. I love that the story of Judah is dropped in where it is. Mm-hmm. The story of Judah and Tamar, rather, is dropped in where it is because it didn't happen at that point in the narrative.
Right.
But it was an ongoing story while other things were unfolding. But it's positioned in the story of Joseph's sexual integrity, mm-hmm. right? He's approached by Potiphar's wife, and he could have taken the easy way out and just done what was asked of him, and been great, no issues, no problem, as long as he didn't get caught, right? But he could have just gone with the flow, mm-hmm. But he had integrity in that area. And then we see Judah in this example of sexual
it's a good contrast,
right? Yeah, so a great contrast of the two. And we see Joseph operating in full integrity the whole way through the story. And then, but we see Judah recognizing the places where he didn't operate in integrity mm-hmm. and repenting of them, both in the story of him and Tamar, and then later on in the end of the story.
Which in a lot of ways makes Judah a lot more interesting as a character too.
Yeah.
I think I like Judah a little bit more at the end, since you reminded me about him redeeming himself with Benjamin there, than I did at the beginning, where I'm like, Judah should probably have died, but so I'm glad that he didn't. I'm glad that. It's kind of cool.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, last question is, how does this story fulfill the story of God through the rest of the Bible?
That's a great question.
Thank you.
It's asked every week. And every week I go, why didn't I prepare more for this question?
Well, and I really do
Kinda
think
what it's called.
I really, I do think that it's in the repentance, it's in the response. As you recognize the sin in your life, to deal with it immediately. When I was at the Bible school, we had a saying that we used to like to pass around, saying, "Do your laundry and do it often," and we need to do that in our sin life. We need to do our laundry and do it often, bring it before the Lord, and recognize that all He wants is repentance. He doesn't need groveling and guilt and penance and all those things. Just repentance, and He honors a repentant heart and leads us in His way. And so I think that that's how I see it, fulfilling the story of God.
Yeah.
Amen.
And more literally, Fletcher, do you want to take this part?
Go
more
for it.
literally, like, God uses Tamar in the Messiah's line.
Right.
And so literally, like, because of her and Judah, Jesus is born to the tribe of
Right.
Judah. So
Yeah.
His sons weren't good enough, and then He used Tamar, who
I
also
guess was
took what was rightfully hers,
Right.
and God used that line. So yeah. And then
so,
Perez and so on and so on. But
That's right.
yeah.
all right.
So that was good.
That's all for today.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much. Have a good week.
Have a good week.
Looking forward to
See
the
you
next one.
later.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.